online ao vivo. Bom dia a todos e bem-vindos à reunião geral. Tirando a máscara. Meu nome é Pedro Macul, eu sou médico psiquiatra formado pela USP. Essa palestra é fruto de um projeto que a gente começou em 2019. Foi um ano que eu tive a oportunidade de fazer um intercâmbio da Universidade de Yale. Lá eu fui recebido por essa pessoa extraordinária que nós temos aqui, que é a professora Leckman, que, além de ser uma sumidade no estudo do TOC da Síndrome de Tourette, é um ser humano extremamente sensível e carinhoso. Eu sou um cara apaixonado por estudar e tratar os transtornos de ansiedade como um todo, e por isso eu conheci a professora Eli Lebowitz, antes do meu intercâmbio, tendo lido seus trabalhos científicos. Alguns meses antes da minha ida, eu havia lido um ensaio publicado pelo professor Eli, mostrando que uma terapia feita exclusivamente com os pais de crianças ansiosas era capaz de ser tão eficaz quanto uma terapia tradicional direcionada para as crianças. Eu achei isso fascinante. Isso mostra como a família tem esse potencial de realmente ajudar e promover melhor a densidade dos filhos, porque as famílias realmente precisam de orientação e acompanhamento adequados. Enfim, uma vez lá em Yale, eu pedi para a professora Leckman se seria possível conhecer o professor Eli, o que de fato aconteceu, e eu me sinto incrivelmente grato. Desse encontro, nós começamos uma colaboração que resultou na vinda deles para cá hoje. Junto com o meu querido orientador, o professor Miguel, que é uma pessoa sem a qual nada disso teria acontecido, nós escrevemos um projeto que foi selecionado pela UCANI, a Agência USP de Cooperação Acadêmica Nacional e Internacional, para ser financiado. Esse projeto inclui a publicação de 2 trabalhos científicos desse grupo que nós formamos. Um deles foi publicado no ano passado e o outro está em vias de ser publicado. O projeto inclui essa visita do professor Leckman e do professor Eli aqui ao Instituto de Psiquiatria. Hoje nós estamos aqui reunidos para a reunião geral e agora vamos ao que interessa, que é apresentar nossos convidados. O professor Eli R estuda e trata transtorno de ansiedade na infância e adolescência. Ele é diretor do Programa for Anxiety Disorders da Universidade de Yale. A sua pesquisa foca no desenvolvimento, neurobiologia e tratamento dos transtornos de ansiedade, com ênfase nas influências familiares e transgeracionais desse transtorno. O professor Lebowitz é autor de diversos artigos científicos e capítulos de livro no tema dos transtornos de ansiedade na infância e adolescência. Ele se formou na Universidade de Tel Aviv, onde também fez seu doutorado, e fez seu pós-doutorado na Universidade de Yale. Ele também é orgulhoso de ser pai de 3 filhos. O professor Leckman é professor de Psiquiatria da Infância e Adolescência, Psicologia e Pediatria na Universidade de Yale. O professor Leckman é conhecido mundialmente pelo seu brilhantismo científico e por suas pesquisas, tendo o paciente em primeiro lugar. Tem sido eleito um dos best doctors na América por seus pares médicos. Por mais de 20 anos, ele serviu como diretor de pesquisa do Yale Child Study Center. Ele já participou como autor ou coautor de mais de 500 artigos, 12 livros e 140 capítulos de livro. O professor Leckman tem particular interesse no TOC e na Síndrome de Tourette, e seus estudos vão desde a neurobiologia e aspectos imunológicos relacionados a esses transtornos, até a sintomatologia e a apresentação clínica. Além de ter recebido o título de professor Nathan Harris, da Universidade de Yale, tenho muito orgulho do fato do professor Leckman ter feito seu doutorado aqui na USP, onde ele ganhou o título de PhD. Por fim, temos que agradecer, então, ao UCANI, a parceria USP-Yale, o Banco Santander, que ajudou nesse projeto, e também muito importante reconhecer 2 famílias que ajudaram muito para que isso também pudesse ser uma realidade, a família do Robert Lira e do Marco Aurélio Gonçalves. Então, agora eu dou a palavra ao professor Leckman.
Obrigado, Pedro. And it's wonderful to be here in person. It's just for God's time. And it's also wonderful to see a few people here in the audience in person. And perhaps the next time I come, we'll be back to the usual, where it's really the entire room is filled in each of the chairs. So I've had a wonderful opportunity the last few days to share with people some of the work that we've been doing. And today I thought I would take the opportunity to tell you a little bit about some of the other international projects that we're working on. But I'm also grateful that there are projects being done here in Brazil. And it makes me think of the work of Cecil Rosario and the work that we're doing in some of the poor communities, both here in the São Paulo area, as well as elsewhere in Salvador, where we're actually trying to have an impact with regard to some disadvantaged children and the group activities that might be involved in terms of supporting those families. Of course, the reality with regard to the COVID pandemic has changed all of this. And it's interesting too, I'll tell you a little bit about some of the other projects that are ongoing that are also included in randomized clinical trials. But again, the pandemic has had a major impact with regard to our ability to complete those studies, with the exception of the study that we did in Lebanon, in Beirut, where we were actually looking at Palestinian families that were living there in Beirut. And we were able to finish those analyses and complete the projects before the pandemic hit. Unfortunately, of course, as you all know, in Lebanon, they've also been going through an enormous crisis with regard to the explosion that occurred, but also the reality on the ground in terms of the government being in really complete disarray, at least maybe not complete, but to a very large degree, let's put it that way. So I have far too many slides, and I probably need to look to Pedro and say, Pedro, when I come close to 40 minutes, or maybe 35 minutes, start waving your hand, and I may go through some of these slides a little more quickly than I should. So I think some of you know I've been here a few times before, but my work really began thanks to Donald Cohen with regard to Tourette syndrome, which before I came to the Child Study Center, I really did not know that much about. And of course, by learning something about Tourette syndrome, the very frequent comorbidity of obsessive-compulsive symptomatology is something that we then began to explore. And I guess it's been a fascinating journey for me with regard to the obsessive-compulsive symptoms. Hey, look who's here. But it's really remarkable when you think about some of the dimensions of obsessive-compulsive symptoms and how normal they are and how evolutionarily conserved they are in our species and certainly in other mammalian species as well. So that's where the term, the normalcy of neurosis comes in. And if anybody's interested in some of the articles we've written about that, I'd be more than happy to share them with you. So what I'll be focused on to a large extent is the importance of nurturing care. And when I look around the room, I see many of the parents that I know their children, and I'm aware of the level of nurturing care that those children have received. And it's something that I'll be talking more about during the work that we're doing. And interestingly, we've had a number of opportunities to get together with international scholars to discuss these topics, and I'll mention that briefly. But we've also started an organization back in 2013 and 14 called the Early Childhood Peace Consortium. And basically, it's bringing together people from all across the globe to try and find a way of investing in children and families as a way of building a more peaceful and socially cohesive world. So there's a picture of Donald. And so everybody that has heard me talk in the last few days, but probably the last few years, knows that one of the slides that I always show is this one. And it basically focuses again on how interconnected we all are. And what's amazing to me about that is that no one neuron does anything. It's only when those neurons work together in the networks that we've been studying that they're able to achieve what they are able to achieve. And of course, they change over the course of time. And really, there are some very specific circuits that have been identified for Tourette syndrome, for some aspects of obsessive-compulsive symptoms, anxiety, etc. And then the most fascinating for me, and it's too bad that we don't have a video of this, but when people have tried to estimate what's actually happening in the cosmos, we see a similar pattern of interconnection, which is really, for me, quite remarkable. So here are two of my favorite quotations.
Try to look here, Jim.
Okay. Happy to. So if we were to teach real peace in this world, and if we were to carry on a real war against war, we have to begin with the children, and you must be the change you hope to see in the world. So this is a message for each one of us. And there can be no keener revelation than a society's soul than the way in which it treats its children. And that's a quote from Nelson Mandela. And of course, the first one was from Mahatma Gandhi. And I'll mention a few things about South Africa, because I'll mention probably something about Alan Apter, who's one of my friends and colleagues, who's originally from South Africa, but is now very actively involved as an academic, but also as a wonderful father in Israel. So one of the journeys that really led to this area of work and interest for me began when I was actually going off on a trip to Israel to visit folks like Alan Apter, but also Ruthie Feldman and others. And I was contacted by one of my friends in Turkey, who also trained with us, Yankıbe Yazgan, and he has two wonderful children. And I guess one of the wonderful stories about Yankıbe, although I'm probably going to not get through all of the slides as a result of telling you all of these stories, is that his daughter, Idil, is now actually a medical student at Yale. So that's wonderful news. And what Yankıbe wanted me to do was to stop and talk with the Mother Child Education Foundation, or otherwise known as ACEV, and they had been looking at this issue, and they had published this paper, Building a Generation of Reconciliation, the Role of Early Child Development in Peace Building. And that was really the place where I began to have some of these thoughts and activities, was in having that discussion with them. And of course, they had developed programs for families, and those were actually the ones that we then have implemented here in Brazil, but also in Lebanon, and interestingly, also in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So this is just one of the pictures when we first went off to talk with them. And I guess one of the other people that I would just mention, and I don't think I need to use the pointer, but Catherine Pater-Brick is a person who's done a lot of international work. She's also at Yale. And it's really just a fascinating story. And one of the papers that I'll refer to, and one of the areas of work that we're very interested in, is building resilience. And it's a fascinating journey, but she's another one of the individuals. But everyone else there, apart from myself, were folks in Turkey. So if anybody has an interest, this was the 13th Ernst Strudman Forum. And the book was published by the Massachusetts of Institute Technology Press back in 2014. And it's Pathways to Peace, the Transformative Power of Children and Families, which is very close to the title of this presentation. So what we were asked to do, and I was one of the organizers for this, this conference that took place in Germany, was to assess the role of early child development and family relationships in the process of violence prevention, peace building, and conflict resolution. and to explore novel approaches to translate the science-based knowledge into concrete and sustainable actions. And what was wonderful about this conference is that it went on for a week. They didn't have any slides, but there were basically work groups that you could join, and it went all the way from the basic science of attachment and the role of compounds like oxytocin and vasopressin and other compounds like that, where the basic scientists were talking about, well, what's going on in this context, all the way to practitioners who actually were implementing programs across the globe with regard to early child development. So how does human biology and human biological development impact peace building? How do events and relationships in childhood set the stage for peace at a personal as well as at social levels? And given the multiple challenges that we have in each of our societies, and I guess as I've been here in Brazil, I think there are a few challenges that you're facing here as well. What kinds of early childhood interventions have the potential for building a more peaceful world? And how can we use new knowledge about child development to create programs and policies? So forgive me, we may not make it all the way to the end of the presentation, but of course at the end what I'll be doing is conveying some of the policy recommendations that we have. And I guess it makes me think of this wonderful opportunity that we had with Ana Estela Haddad, and I'm not sure how actively she's involved now, but of course she's one of the people that really believed in early child development and a way in which we could actually improve the realities and the outcomes of many of the children here in Brazil. And this is just actually the first meeting that we had at the launch. And what's wonderful about this too is that we have all sorts of international organizations, including the United Nations and UNICEF, as well as many other organizations. And I'm not sure if I don't want to go through and point out all of the people that are here, but I'll just mention my dear friend, Kyle Pruitt, who is an expert about the role of fathers. Here is Pia Brito. For many years, she was basically head of the early childhood program at UNICEF, and she's now the program director for UNICEF in Laos. And another dear friend is this young lady who's a world's expert with regard to oxytocin, and I'll be coming back to some of her work in a few minutes. So the mission of our Early Childhood Peace Consortium is to create a legacy of sustained peace by drawing on the transformative power of early child development, and the global community must address the root causes of violence and the fact that children and families can be agents of change. So I'm not going to go through this in a lot of detail, except to tell you that the picture that you see there with the young mother and her baby is nobody else besides my daughter Emily and my older grandson Caleb, but some of the animal model work that we have been looking at as well is also illustrated here, but also the role of attachment, John Bowlby, and some of the other individuals that really have led the way in terms of helping us understand these realities. And of course, we all know that our genetic blueprint provides the broad strokes of development for both our brains and our body. And the environment, of course, modifies this blueprint during critical periods of development from preconception onward. This was actually in 2017. I was honored to be part of this Lancet series on early child development, and particularly the one article there by Pia Brito. I was one of the authors of that group as well, Nurturing Care and the Promotion of Child Development. But basically looking at what data do we have with regard to all of the scientific disciplines that may contribute to this discussion, and what we know in terms of the impact of early child development programs that have been implemented. And interestingly, many of the long-term outcomes that we have access to, for better or for worse, are studies that were done in the United States, and hopefully that will be changing over the course of the next few decades. And then Linda Richter and investing in the foundations of sustainable development. And it's interesting because I'll come back to this if there's time to really say that if we make a bigger investment in our children, we will actually have a more successful and there's a monetary value to making that investment in terms of the cost to society. So one of the concepts that I'd like to share with you is this notion of nurturing care. And they are highlighted in this figure here, right here, and basically talk about love and security, adequate nutrition, responsive caregiving, healthcare, protection from danger, and opportunities to discover the world. And I'm very grateful for my opportunity to help Eli Lebowitz discover the realities of life here in Brazil. But it's also fascinating to me in listening to some of his presentations that we've heard over the last few days that love and security and responsive caregiving are hallmarks of many of the programs that he has been working with in terms of helping families dealing with anxiety in their children and moving forward with that. So here is just what you see in that article by Pia Brito, and basically looking over the course of early development and seeing what we know in terms of long-term data from programs that have actually focused on these periods of time and development and interventions across the life course. And of course, parenting programs are a big part of that for sure. So it's fostered by supportive environments, nurturing care by parents and caregivers, and eventually we will be talking, if there's time, to talk about the importance of really engaging in discussions with national leaders and policymakers to try and have a bigger impact. And sadly, and I believe this is true in Brazil as well as in other parts of the world, the amount of money and resources that governments and societies are willing to invest in very early development of children is much lower than it should be in terms of really making a difference. So we know that children need nurturing care from the start, and there's very strong evidence in support of that. And interestingly, early life experiences that determine the capacity of the brain and its structure and function. That being said, just because you've had a horrific early life, just because your family may have been, destroyed in one way or another, doesn't mean that that is set in stone in terms of your inability to really be successful in your life and again, this question of how to help build resilience, especially in conflict-affected regions, is something that is really quite important. And what's fascinating to me is that one of the approaches that I'll be talking about is creating the interconnections between individuals and families. And this is another thing that echoes very deeply from some of the things that we've been hearing from Professor Lebowitz in terms of those interconnections. So parenting provides a legacy that transcends genes. And one of the areas I've had an interest in over the years is the whole issue of epigenetics. And we could talk much more about that, but there's not really time. But parenting has a direct impact on brain structure and function, as well as an individual's physical health. And interestingly, early child development programs that are aimed at enhancing responsive caregiving can reduce adverse childhood experiences, things like poor nutrition, neglect, abuse, and other forms of dysfunction in the home. And they can also positively impact brain structure and function, as well as our hormonal and, as I was talking about over the last few days, our immune system. And it's one of the areas that we need to learn much more about. But we used to think it was just there to help protect us from the bugs and bacteria that are out there. But the reality is that everyone that I'm looking at here has hundreds of millions of microbiota that are actually present in their bodies, and we have co-evolved with them, and they were here long before we ever were. And so we found a way to sort of live with them. Some of these other figures are about the role of hormones like oxytocin, and we know, of course, oxytocin is involved in uterine contractions and birth. It's very involved in release of milk, during times where you're actually breastfeeding the child. But interestingly, it also goes up very high during sexual activity. And we don't need to go in much detail, but it's a fascinating hormone that really is all through our bodies. And here is two of the experts, Sue Carter, who we were talking about earlier, and Ruthie Feldman, and they're two of the people that I've worked with very closely with regard to the whole oxytocin story. And here's an interesting family as well, originally from Iran, and they're good friends, and actually they were with us for 2 years after they first arrived in the United States. But it's just a fascinating story in terms of the neural circuitry. And this young baby now is, I think, 8 years of age, and not too long ago we actually had a dinner with them. But higher levels of oxytocin are associated with responsive and affectionate caregiving, and empathetic responses to their baby's cries, and more securely attached individuals as adults show an increased reward response to being with their baby and less of an adverse reaction. And we've also looked at this in terms of what's going on in the father's brain. And we can talk more about that as well. And here is one of the articles by Catherine Panter-Brick that I was also honored to be a co-author, and basically reviewing what do we know about the role of dads. And I think oftentimes that's been neglected in terms of our scientific studies, but they're very important elements, and it's fascinating to reflect again on the presentations we've been hearing from Professor Lebowitz, that it's not just the mothers that we need to focus on, but what is the nature of those family dynamics, and what role is the father playing? And we could go into this in more detail, but it's interesting when you look at very early development, what you see is that the mothers are very involved in sort of the back and forth, and this is thinking about infants. Oh, look at the little baby. Oh, ba, ba, ba. And basically the eye contact and the rest of it is sort of characteristic of very early maternal interactions with their baby. But what about the dads? We're running out of time. We have 2 minutes.
No, he's saying touching.
Yes.
No?
Yes. But interestingly, with the dads, stimulatory play is one of the things that's been emphasized in terms of the academic literature. And I'm not sure if I were to look at my colleague here, but I would bet that he has actually thrown his babies up in the air. And we probably could find some videos of that as well. So fathers matter. Studies have shown the protective and positive impact of fathers' involvement with their children's social, emotional, behavioral, and psychological outcomes. And positive outcomes include psychological health, less behavioral problems in terms of the things that we see, and certainly delinquency and criminality and the rest of it. But we don't need to go into this in a great deal of detail, but fathers do matter. And here's one of the things that I've been very curious about, and it's just amazing to me as I learn more about this. And we talked a fair amount about this over the course of the last few days. But the microbiome, and this book that is down here by a group of authors up at Harvard, really talks about the importance of the gut. And they really see it as really a separate organ. But of course, it is an organ that has a different characteristic, whether you're talking about what's going on in the mouth, whether you're talking about what's on the skin, or what you're talking about in terms of the gastrointestinal tract. And we can come back to this. And a sad reality is that many children in Brazil, but also in the United States and around the world, do not receive adequate nurturing care. And this whole issue of domestic violence, I mean, it's really just tragic, because it also makes me think of the street children here in Brazil and, you know, what have they been through, what really has led them to the outcomes that we're currently seeing as we pass them on the street. But the World Health Organization has estimated that as many as 1 out of 2 children in the age group of 2 to 17 have had to suffer some violence each year, and 1 in 10 are sexually abused by the age of 18. And that's a whole nother story that could be, you know, the topic for a much longer set of discussions. But it's also fascinating to me to realize that oftentimes those things are kept secret. They're not something that is shared widely with even close family members and others in terms of what actually has happened. And for many children, the development of toxic stress is compounded by situations of migration, immigration, war, conflict, and the extreme violence to which families are exposed. And again, it makes me think of my friends and colleagues in the Middle East, particularly in Lebanon these days, with the complete tragedy that's going on there, with that huge explosion and the economic difficulties that they're currently facing. So there is a risk to society in terms of exposure to toxic stress. We're doing really okay on time.
We have 10 minutes.
5 minutes?
Yeah.
10 minutes. Hey, I might get through this and don't have to talk so fast. So, but certainly early exposure to toxic stress, whether it's inadequate nutrition, harm to the child's emotional, physical, or cognitive development, can result from a loss of human capital, including a decrease in the economic productivity of that individual and their participation in the family. And some of the other societal risks include decreased trust, inequalities across cultures and genders, a loss of social cohesion, and increased rates of violent crime. So it makes sense for us to invest in early child development. If we can do a better job as a society and as members of families, and if we can interconnect better in a more positive way, it can have a very positive impact. And I guess I'm just going to say this again, but it's on the slide. Early child development services can make a significant contribution to peace building, social cohesion, and sustainable development. And high-quality services that focus on creating and sustaining nurturing environments can not only improve the child's short-term developmental outcomes, but they're also associated with long-term outcomes in adulthood as well. So believe it or not, these are the sites where we're doing our various projects around the globe. The ones that are presented in yellow, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, and Brazil, are ones where they're actually randomized clinical trials evaluating early parenting programs. The others are actually ones where we're doing pilot studies, and this is, I'll come back to this in a few minutes, but basically we're working with a group that's based in the UK, but has very active programs in all of these other countries, whether it be Colombia or Mali or Egypt, Timor-Leste, Vietnam, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and we have pilot programs that are ongoing there, and we can talk more about that as well. And I have in green here Turkey, because in some ways the randomized clinical trials are in part based on a program that was initially developed in Turkey, but interestingly also was something that was supported by one of our colleagues at Yale, who is no longer with us, but Ed Ziegler was the person who really had many of the elements that are present in the MOCHEF program of early child development. So the Mother Child Education Program, and this is the Turkish program, has the mission of promoting human development to its maximum potential through investing in young children and families. And I don't need to go through this in detail, but we're here in Brazil, so let me say a few words about some of the ongoing programs here. This was a wonderful opportunity that we had to bring a number of scholars and practitioners from Brazil to New Haven some years ago. And there you can see in the middle there, Ana Estela Haddad, and she was, as you all know, the First Lady of here in the state of São Paulo, and she has been very interested in early child development, but there are a number of other people. But it was wonderful to, and of course, Cesar Rosario is there next to her as well. But she was the one that was really responsible for the São Paulo Caranosa project. But it's also interesting too, because we've recently also been very actively involved in Primeiros Lactos program, as well as some of the other programs. And the Gates Foundation has been one of the groups that has that has actually been promoting and supporting some of the work that we've been doing with Cesar Rosario. And that's what I have here, the mother support groups and teacher support programs. And what's wonderful about these programs is that they bring parents together as well as the children. And what's remarkable is that when you can actually help support the interconnection between families, they can be a real source of support even after the program has completely finished. So they're an ongoing source of support. It's really, and I guess the other thing to say is early child development realities in one part of the world, or even in one part of a country, are different than what is actually going on in other parts of the world and the rest of it. So even though CESA has been using the program at some level that was developed by the ACHEF program, it's of course been adapted to the situation there in some of the poor districts here in the state of Sao Paulo, as well as the work that she's been doing up north in Salvador. But I guess it's also interesting that, the realities in terms of really getting funding for some of these projects. And then, of course, the other reality in the COVID-19 world is that, in fact, some of these programs have really had to change completely in terms of the way in which they're being delivered and the data collection and all of the other aspects of the project. And that is certainly true in Imbu, as well as in the project she's doing up north. 2 minutes? Okay. So I'm going to highlight, here's a paper that was just published in April of this year, promoting mother-infant relationships and the underlying neural correlates, results from randomized clinical trials. And I was honored to be one of the co-authors of that paper. And this is actually the separate program, and hopefully I'll be seeing Guilherme in not too long a time, later today or tomorrow. And I don't need to go through this in detail, but basically the results of this study in a very poor group of families was that the results were very positive in creating a stronger mother-infant attachment, and they were present in families randomized to the intervention group that completed the program and were evaluated at the endpoint. And wonderfully, Professor Euripides Miguel has really taken the lead in this National Center for Research and Innovation in Mental Health. And I'm looking forward to learning more about that. And perhaps later today we can have some discussions. But it's another one of the areas where there is a great investment in early child development programs. We've been talking a lot about obsessive-compulsive symptom dimensions and child psychopathology. This is another one of the papers that just recently came out this year. Here's another paper that also the link between the mother and the child's obsessive-compulsive symptoms and mediation models in a healthy community sample. I think I'm just going to run through these. These are things that certainly Professor Lebowitz will be talking about, and the whole issue of family accommodation, innovative interventions that he's helped develop with the parents in terms of space, parents working together with their children and exploring the neural circuitry or some of the other areas that he's been actively involved in. These are some of our colleagues. I guess I'll probably not go through them in any detail, but Hiro Hoshikawa, wonderful colleague, also some of the folks in Northern Ireland. And that's an interesting reality too in Northern Ireland, because there were these ongoing conflicts, and still there is a fair amount of conflict between the Catholic and Protestant communities. But some of the programs that were developed very early on that have actually had a very positive and long-lasting impact are ones that involve bringing parents together from different ethnic and religious backgrounds in raising their new children. So here's a paper that was just recently published that Pia was the first author, but I was honored to actually be the one that organized it. And that's a picture of our good friend and colleague who was really the origin of many of these parenting programs over the years. So This is something that I'm not sure it's been accepted for publication, but I'm not sure that it actually has appeared online yet. But this is Love and Peace Across Generations, Biobehavioral Systems and Global Partnerships. And many of the individuals, and you can see Catherine Panter-Brick there and Kyle Pruitt, Pia Brito, many of the other people as well. So I'll just say we're continuing to do work in Israel. And it's interesting, we just received word probably earlier this month that our USAID project in bringing Israeli and Palestinian mental health professionals together in promoting health was funded by this program in the United States for international projects. Makes me think of Simon Baron-Cohen and Hesti and Haifa Strati and others, but there's not time to go through this. So I mentioned the economic benefits, but it turns out that if you invest in early child development, you actually have a greater long-term outcome than if you make an investment later in the age of the child. This is one of the policy briefs that we prepared, Contributions of Early Child Development Services to Preventing Violent Conflict and Sustaining Peace. And what we found that if we actually talk with policymakers and government officials, they're much more influenced by hearing the personal stories of families and what the impact has been with regard to their engagement with some of these programs than seeing the scientific papers that we spend so much time writing and rewriting and doing one thing or another. This is our theory of change in terms of peace-building informed policies and programs of proven value, that they have this ability to strengthen the vertical and social cohesion of societies, as well as increased economic and sustainable development opportunities. But we can go through this, and of course the slides will be available to you, and if you have an interest, I'd certainly be glad to share them with you. You probably have all heard about the Sustainable Development Goals, and that's certainly something that if you invest in early childhood, you're going to be able to be in a much better place to actually reach some of those goals, although it's a real challenge these days. So the take-home message, and I'm going to end with this, we need to take action to make our world a better place for children and for future generations. And I guess I want to look at each one of you and say, and the next steps include a commitment to refine, adapt, and implement sustainable programs of proven value, but each one of them needs to be adapted for the environment in which you're going to be implementing them. So here's a picture of Professor Lebowitz, as well as our dear friends. And believe it or not, we have some of the colleagues that are here with us in our audience. And interestingly, I just learned that one of my friends and colleagues is going to be actually presenting at the end. I guess the other person I should really highlight is Rima Salah. But Rima is actually the person who's currently directing the Early Childhood Peace Consortium. And she's originally was born in Jerusalem, although she's a Christian lady. She is really and has worked in UNICEF for decades before she now has an apartment just across the street from the United Nations. But these are just a few of the colleagues. And I guess I'll be seeing Guilherme later today. But thank you. I think that probably is it.
We'll do it.
Okay. Perfecto.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. Well, I think I just find myself torn between hope and despair listening to Dr. Leckman's talk. It's so inspiring, and you feel hope at all the work that's being done, and also despair at all the challenges that we face as a society. But I think if Dr. Leckman can stay hopeful and energized in working so hard to improve the future of our world, I think maybe we can all take some inspiration from that for ourselves as well. And mainly on this, the last day of my first visit to Brazil, my heart is just full of gratitude for this opportunity to have been here, to have made new friends and collaborators, and seen new places and experienced new things and foods and drinks. And so I really just feel very thankful. And over the past few days, I've spoken a lot about this treatment, SPACE, which stands for Supportive Parenting for Anxious Childhood Emotions, which is a parent-based treatment for child anxiety and OCD that focuses on helping parents to increase their supportive responses to their children and to reduce family accommodation of children's symptoms. And we talked about the treatment in great detail over many hours, so we won't try to recap that now. We also talked some about the evidence that continues to mount for the efficacy of this approach. I shared some of these data from a fairly sizable randomized controlled trial of SPACE, comparing it to cognitive behavioral therapy and finding it to be non-inferior or as effective or efficacious as CBT for these problems in children. But what I wanted to do with the time that we have today is share some of the things that are exciting to me right now in terms of new work that we're doing, both clinical and more translational, and just some more ongoing and earlier stage projects that we've been working on in collaborations with so many wonderful people that I'm honored to be able to work together with. So that's what I wanted to try to focus on. You know, these data from this clinical trial, they are talking about the efficacy of the two treatments of cognitive behavioral therapy and of SPACE. But one really important goal, and one that was also addressed in some of the presentations we had the pleasure of hearing about earlier this morning by some of the work being done right here at the university, one important goal relates to identifying moderators of treatment outcomes. In other words, when we have different treatments that are of similar efficacy overall, sometimes it's still possible that those treatments may have really different efficacy for different patients, for different children. And those can be hidden inside our data sets. They're not always obvious. But if we can find them, then we may be able to amplify the overall efficacy of our treatments beyond what we see for the general samples that we're examining. Right. So for example, if we had a treatment that worked for all the boys and a different treatment that worked for all the girls, but not the other way around, that we would have two treatments with 50% efficacy. But if we knew that, we would actually have 100% efficacy by just knowing that that moderator actually distinguishes between the two treatments. And that is it's a little bit of a holy grail in terms of this, amplifying the efficacy of our treatments and bringing what we sometimes call a precision medicine model to mental health and psychiatry or psychology. And so we've been trying to look at those moderators in our data. And in a very interesting and enjoyable collaboration with a professor by the name of Sigal Zilcha-Mano from the University of Haifa, we've been trying to use machine learning algorithms to examine potential moderators and identify which are the variables that actually distinguish who responds to which treatment between space and cognitive behavioral therapy. And we still have a long way to go down that road before we're able to translate this into actual clinical guidelines. But it's really interesting to me that this so-called random forest machine learning method is identifying some variables. And some of those are ones that you might guess at, like parent style, parental negativity, for example. But some of them are even biological variables. And Dr. Leckman spoke before about the role of oxytocin in modulating our interpersonal relationships, parenting, and also romantic. And it's interesting to me that two variables that were selected by this algorithm were the child and the parents' oxytocin levels measured in their saliva. And so it may be that maybe a few more years down the line, we'll be able to put together clinical and biological variables to decide which treatment we should be prescribing for a particular child when we're trying to make the best guess of how we should be proceeding with their clinical care. I think that's really exciting. And I also mentioned this, we're using brain imaging to try to identify mechanisms of change in these treatments. And so by using, in this case, functional magnetic resonance imaging before and after treatment, we can learn about what is changing in children's brains as they go through therapy, whether that is cognitive behavioral therapy or whether it is a parent-based treatment. And that's another area that I think is very exciting to me, because if we can identify not only what treatments work, but also how they are working, it can teach us more about the pathophysiology of these problems, but also maybe help us to further refine our treatments. For example, maybe we would be better able to figure out what are the most active ingredients in our treatment. What are the things that we most need to focus on? And the more we can streamline our therapies, the more resource effective we can be. And so I think that is really exciting and interesting as well. Now, what I wanted to do also is mention some work that we've been doing in trying to understand, using our data from these clinical trials to also understand some of what is happening to children as they live through a global pandemic. The pandemic was extremely, I guess, problematic for our research, because when you're doing brain imaging research, it's very hard to do that over Zoom, it turns out. And so we had some serious setbacks in being able to continue in an ongoing way, the work that we were doing. But it also gave us an opportunity to try to understand a little bit about the effects of the pandemic using the data that we were collecting. Dr. Leckman was speaking a lot about the way in which parenting and caregiving might provide buffering against some of the adversity that children may be exposed to. And this is not exactly that, but I think it sort of relates, because one of the things that we saw in our data is that children whose parents, whose attachment figures, their caregivers, and in particular their mothers, buffered against the effects of an anxiety-inducing stimulus in a brain imaging paradigm. So, for example, if you have the child in a brain scanner and you show them some scary pictures, and you look at how much their brain is responding to those pictures with fear, and then you look at how much being near their parent might buffer against that fear response in the scanner, Well, what we see is that children whose mothers were buffering against the fear during the brain imaging paradigm were also buffered against the effects of COVID-19 related stress on their actual anxiety levels months later. And so I think it is just fascinating to see how, this kind of natural experiment that we've all been thrown into through COVID-19 is sort of providing some opportunities to actually further, I guess, deepen our understanding of some of the ways in which caregiving and parenting and attachment can actually help to protect us against some forms of adversity. Now, another thing that I wanted to quickly talk about were some of the more recent adaptations and modifications of the space treatment program to other areas beyond the anxiety and obsessive compulsive disorder that were the original focus of the treatment. Because anxiety and OCD, they're not the only situations characterized by high levels of parental accommodation. And Yara Shimshoni, who I think you can sort of see in the picture, a little bit obscured, but Yara Shimshoni is a wonderful therapist who worked in our program for many years and now has gone back to living on her kibbutz in Israel. But what she was thinking a lot about when she was working with us was, what about all these children with picky eating who we are seeing in our anxiety program, and we are calling them food phobia, but actually what they really seem to have is a bit of an eating disorder with a lot of anxiety as well. And in 2013, when the DSM-5 came out, there was this new diagnosis, ARFID, or Avoidant Restrictive Food Intake Disorder, what normal people call very, very picky eating. And this is a really challenging situation for a lot of families because the picky eating, it creates problems not only health-wise in terms of energy intake, nutrition, but also a lot of psychosocial impairment for children and for families because you can't take the vacation, your child won't find something to eat if it's not at home, or go to a restaurant, or the child can't go to play dates because they won't have anything to eat. And there's a tremendous amount of accommodation that surrounds that as well. And so what Yara did was to take the space protocol that focuses on increasing support and reducing accommodation and to adapt it for ARFID, and has been testing that. We've published 1 or 2 papers on this, including a small clinical trial looking at applying this parent-based treatment for ARFID, which usually presents in one of these or more than one of these 3 main styles, the most common being children who are very picky based on sensory characteristics of food, like the color, the texture, the smell, shape, things like that, but sometimes fear of negative consequences of eating, for example, a fear of choking. And so you can imagine a child who's so scared of choking, parent might be accommodating that by pureeing all of the child's food in a blender before they eat it. And so you could see how that might cause a lot of interference, both for the family, but really hard to go to a restaurant if all you eat is pureed food, for example. And sometimes based more on low appetite, what seems to be a kind of lack of interest in trying foods or eating foods. And what Yara did is to recognize that in addition to the increasing support and reducing accommodation that are the hallmarks of kind of typical space as we developed it for anxiety and OCD, there was also real need of working on reducing some of the stress relating to eating, because in many of the families we were seeing, mealtimes had just become like a battlefield fraught with tremendous stress as parents are doing everything they can to get their kid to try a food and eat something else, and sometimes prizes, sometimes punishments. You don't get dessert because you didn't eat a bite. And there's so much stress that goes into this that we added this third component of reducing food-related stress before we even try to reduce the accommodation. We were able to do, so far, one preliminary pilot clinical study in families of children with ARFID, which was published in the Journal of Eating Disorders, and found good indications of satisfaction in terms of and feasibility, acceptability of this treatment, as well as good improvement in terms of the number of children who no longer met criteria for ARFID following treatment or the decrease in the severity of their symptoms and impairment. So I'm just going through that fairly quickly, but we see significant improvement. That is one of the adaptations of space that I wanted to mention. A second one is one that is even newer in terms of its development. And here I would highlight collaborations with several people. Wendy Silverman is the director of the Anxiety and Mood Disorders Program at the Child Study Center. Jean Shapiro is a professor in pediatrics, and Amanda Calhoun is one of our psychiatry residents, and Becca Etkin is a postdoctoral associate. And Amanda and Becca have been leading a group for parents of children with unexplained medical, physical, somatic symptoms, right? The chronic pains, fatigue, stomach ache, headache, etc., which also lead to tremendous impairment in children's lives, like the ability to go to school, to function, etc., and are likewise very frequently associated with a lot of accommodation on the parent side. Sometimes what it feels like is that life is just on hold until some medical cure can be found for these symptoms. The problem is that that cure is not always found, and maybe one day it will be, but in the meantime, children are just going through life very, very impaired without functioning. And so what we try to do in this group is to use those same principles of support and reducing accommodation. So we start from a place that acknowledges that the children's symptoms are real. They are experiencing genuine distress, that the pain is real, but also with some confidence in their ability to tolerate a little bit of that discomfort and to maintain some level of function, because the accumulating impairment from more and more weeks, months, or years of not functioning end up being really, really devastating to children's development and really long-term prospects. And so we're trying to help parents to get a little bit more functional improvement, even while they continue to look for medical answers to the physical symptoms. Here also we have some very promising results. These are data from a tiny, tiny, tiny group of, one clinical group that we did. So I wouldn't focus on the statistical analyses here, but you can see a very promising trend toward reduction in both symptoms, but also improvement in quality of life for these adolescents, and better functioning, less impairment, less anxiety and depression as well. And on the parent side, we see reduced parenting stress. And my favorite quote from one of the parents who was in that group was when she said, "I learned it's not about waiting for the storm to pass, but learning to dance in the rain." Meaning, how can I have a life and function even while I'm still living through the difficulty of these somatic symptoms? So that was adaptation number 2. Adaptation number 3, I'm going really quickly, is bringing us out of the realm of child and adolescent and actually into adulthood, because here we're working with the parents of adult children who are not transitioning to independent functional adulthood, meaning they're living at home with their parents typically, or sometimes living somewhere else, but at the parents' expense. They're not working, they're not in higher education or training, they're basically doing nothing. And this is a situation sometimes in America, sometimes people call it failure to launch. And other places in the world call it by any number of other names, like NEAT or hikikomori or boomerang children, like all these different names, some of them a little bit disparaging. This is a huge problem in the world, and it's a problem that we know very little about, actually. There's not a lot of research, not a lot of resources on why so many adult children are just stuck in life. One of the reasons that we don't know more about it is there's a lot of myths surrounding this phenomenon, like the idea that, it's kind of a new age millennial style problem, or that it's just because parents are so indulgent, or they don't want their kids to grow up, or the children are just really lazy and just enjoy living at their parents' expense. None of that is true in my experience with many, many, many families. I think that is really not true, at least usually not true. There's a lot of suffering, there's a lot of struggle, there's a lot of shame and isolation that goes along with this phenomenon. It's very painful for families when an adult child is not moving on in life, and everybody else's children seem to be growing up and getting jobs and getting married, and your child is awake all night on computer and sleeping during the day, and another year goes by with them doing nothing. It's actually a very painful situation, and parents feel very helpless. We don't know, there's a lot we don't know about this phenomenon, like how prevalent it is, what are the predictors for it, what are the risk factors, what are the trajectories, and what should we do about it? And here I would highlight the work of another wonderful postdoc by the name of Uri Berger, who's been working very hard to try to fill some of these gaps. We are right now sending out a nationwide for the US survey to a nationally representative sample of households to just try to identify what is the prevalence of this problem in the population. If our best guesses are right, we're talking about millions of individuals in the United States and actually billions of dollars annually in lost tax revenue because people aren't working, and GDP loss, et cetera. We're also using other surveys that have been done over years with multiple waves, examining cohorts over years to try to look at precursors and trajectories. So like the Ad Health survey has been done really 5 times and looks at markers from adolescence and all the way into adulthood in a sample in the United States. And so using that, we can go back and say, who seems to have this kind of failure to launch in adulthood? And what were they like in adolescence? What was different about them in adolescence? And we see a whole lot of variables. And if these continue to be replicated in other data, then it gives us some risk factors, some indications that might help us to prevent this situation, to intervene and not let people just sort of crash as they try to move to adulthood, but actually intervene to support that transition rather than leaving families alone to pick up the pieces. So you see there's like behavioral things, there's mental health markers, social markers, academic things, and even physical markers like height and pubertal status and things like that. So I think that's really interesting. We also try to look at the trajectories, how chronic and persistent of a problem this is. And what we see in the data matches what we see clinically, which is it is a chronic and persistent problem. For example, when we look at the wave of data from when people were ages 18 to 24 and try to pull out from that, who seems to be in that failure to launch situation then? Well, when we check again, 9 years later, that person still has a 4-fold likelihood of not living independently relative to the other people. So we're talking about a really long-term problem, which also matches what I see clinically. I will tell you, a lot of people talk about young adults when they think about this problem. It's not a young adult problem. It is an adult problem because it can persist for a very long time. Last year, I met with a woman because of her son. The woman was 85 years old and the son was in his 50s, but had been stuck for so long. Now she was, not a young person anymore and deeply worried about what would happen to this son when she is no longer there to support him financially, etc. And his sister also came to the meeting, and she also had concerns, but she also had concerns that any inheritance she might have had was being squandered by this individual who's not working and not being independent. And so you can imagine the stress and conflict that this can, create for families. And leads us to what to do about it. Well, here again, we're talking about a high accommodation situation, because parents are providing everything for these, adult children. And one of the problems in terms of intervening is that the adult children themselves are often not open to doing any kind of therapy. If you can avoid going to school, you can avoid going to work, you can also avoid going to therapy. That's pretty easy. And so working with parents provides a really important avenue for intervention. We've been doing a clinical study working with parents. The study's still ongoing, so I won't say too much, but I will say that based on the ones that have already completed treatment, we have out of 11 who completed treatment so far, 64% no longer met our entry criteria for failure to launch by the end. And that is compared to 0% in the waitlist control. So I think that is at least promising. And in the ones who are no longer meeting our definition of failure to launch, we see significant improvement in clinical markers and of functioning. Now, those are more clinical things. I did want to mention some of the other work and new projects that are going on. This is a project trying to learn about the networks of and the associations between different variables. This is a project I like, and it is really a project by Pedro, who's sitting over there. In fact, you can see a picture of him explaining the project half an hour ago, or what is it, an hour ago, in the other room down the hall. So it's a little, fractal. Maybe go into that picture, and then you see another smaller picture of him, and it goes on. But what's really exciting about this is that using a fairly large data set, we can begin to map out associations between different variables that we know from our clinical experience and from different, more specific kind of analyses. We know that these things hang together, but we don't always know how, right? Like different kinds of anxiety symptoms, like separation anxiety, social anxiety, panic symptoms. And we know that they're linked to family accommodation. And we know that they're linked to parent anxiety, but how do they all hang together? And doing this kind of network can really show us the picture of that kind of thing. One of the, I think, really interesting to me results from that study, which should be published pretty soon, I think, will be showing, for example, that when children have physical symptoms of anxiety, that often leads to accommodation in the parents, but that then leads to them actually having more problems attending school, because one way that parents accommodate is by allowing child to stay home from school. So you see this pathway that really matches what we see clinically, and that kind of network analysis is really nice for being able to map it out. Some other projects that are ongoing, this is a collaboration with Tom Fernandez at the Child Study Center and Emily Ofson, trying to identify some genes that might be implicated in anxiety disorders. We know there's a lot of research suggesting that there is some genetic heritability for anxiety. Nobody really knows what are the genes that are driving the development of anxiety disorders. We don't really have a good answer for that yet. And Tom, who's a brilliant psychiatrist and geneticist, has been using this method of identifying de novo mutations in the DNA of families. So we take DNA samples from a child and both parents, and then you can see what are the de novo mutations, new mutations that are showing up in the genome of the child with anxiety. And if you can find, the first thing we test is, are there more mutations in those children with anxiety problems relative to a control sample of children who don't have anxiety? And we see the answer is yes. So this clinical sample is enriched for these mutations. But then what you can do is then go further and say, okay, where are these mutations occurring? And once you know where they are occurring, that might give you a hint to which genes are implicated in the development of anxiety. And in fact, I think this is really, really promising, because one thing that we see is that the genes that on which these mutations are occurring are genes that have in the past, at least in some of the cases, have in the past been implicated in other central nervous system phenomena or problems, like developmental disorders, for example. And so it starts to strengthen the hypothesis that maybe this is pointing towards some of the genes implicated in anxiety. And that paper is under review and not yet published, but I think it's a really exciting area of research. And I think this is the last thing I'll touch on, because I've used up my time, but working with Flora Vaccarino, who's a brilliant scientist at the Child Study Center, and with Natalina Salmosa, who used to be at the Child Study Center, working with Flora and is now in Canada running her own lab. What they were doing is looking at the role of fibroblast growth factor 2, FGF2, which is one of a family of fibroblast growth factors. These are these factors that are involved in really cell generation and growth, right? So like, you cut your finger and you need something in your body to tell your, skin to make more skin. So you have growth factors are involved in that, but also in the development and creation of nerve cells, neurons, and particularly implicated during the prenatal period when the brain is forming. And what Natalina had shown was a few things, actually. One is that in mice, the levels of FGF2 are related to behavioral models, these animal models of anxiety, like how willing a mouse is to spend time in an open part of a maze, right, relative to a kind of more sheltered part of a maze. And more anxious mice usually tend to huddle in the more closed parts. So you have like a model for looking at anxiety in animals. And if you knock out the gene to generate this FGF2, so you get like a mouse without FGF2 essentially, you see a much more anxious model of behavior in the mouse. And if you look at, this was also in Flora's lab, if you look at the brain tissue, post-mortem brain tissue of individuals with a history of mood and anxiety disorders, you can see evidence of lower FGF2 gene expression. And so that made us really curious. Well, what about, real live human children? Not post-mortem tissue, not mice, but what about real life children? If we looked at levels of FGF2 in their blood, would we see any indication of a relation to anxiety or depression? And this was published, I guess, last year in the Journal of Affective Disorders, this paper called FGF2 Implicated in Child Anxiety and Depression, because that is in fact what we saw, that if you measure the FGF2 in the blood of children, you see these links to anxiety and depression. Here they're linked together into like one latent variable, but also if you look, if you were to look at them as separate markers. And so FGF2 is one of these variables contributing to the latent variable of anxiety and depression, and it's correlated with the levels of child depression symptoms and trait anxiety and reward responsiveness. I think this is just fascinating, in part because it may be teaching us about, again, more about the pathophysiology or the etiology of anxiety, but also because maybe there's some pathway to some kind of interventions targeting the fibroblast system. And I'm not envisioning that we'll probably be giving FGF2 to people directly all that soon, or maybe even ever, but we don't have any medications that target that system at the moment. So even if there are some downstream possibilities of targeting it, that could open up a new possibility for intervention, maybe. And another last thing I'll say on this is that we're now looking, using our data from the brain imaging, even structural brain imaging, and the measurement of FGF2 in the blood, do we see any links there between how the brain is actually formed physically and the level of FGF2? Because one way that this could be affecting anxiety is by actually affecting brain formation during the prenatal period. And maybe we could see echoes of that even in children and their brains years later when we see them in the lab. So this is, as I said at the beginning, very preliminary work, but exciting, I think. And it's really just interesting to see where this will continue going. So I think that's all I wanted to say. Thank you to so many people that, it's just, I have the pleasure and the honor of learning from and working with, including, of course, and chief among them, Dr. Leckman, who's the person who's probably more responsible or more to blame than anybody for me being here able to speak to you about this, about this work. And thank you to each and every one of you in the room and online as well. So, obrigado.
Coisa para cá? Dá para virar o microfone?
Daqui também.
Não, a imagem para cá.
Eu acho que não. Ele deixou daquele jeito.
Let me be close to you, Eli, just a little bit more, just to be both of you. Just a quick comment. I think Jim Leckman and Eli Lebowitz they have a very good mother. They had a very good mother. And I'm going to say why in the end of my comment. So it took me a while to understand Jim's approach to peace, this idea that supporting families, you can promote peace in the world. And he has been so influential in our lives. So Eli was telling in his life also how Jim was influential. And one of the influence, Eli, that Jim promote among several others includes a family partnership program that we have been developing here in Brazil. He mentioned Projeto Primeiros Laços. No? This project focuses on mothers, on adolescent mothers who are poor and they are pregnant. And the project is led by Glenn Polanzik. This project, we did a pilot. Now we're doing an efficacy trial, and you'll do an effective trial soon. In this pilot, we had already some results, and we were able, after 2 years, when we measured some outcomes in the children who are 2 years old now they are older now, but when they were 2 years old, we had a higher clear measures of better neurodevelopment measures, several neurodevelopment measures. This is the work of Daniel Fattori. We had some markers of these neurodevelopment measures using EEG, showing better communication, for instance, in the intervention group compared to the control. This is the work of Lizzie Shepard. We had more interesting, Jim showed here, that the children from the mothers who was submitted to the intervention, they have a more secure attachment. The levels of secure attachments was closer to the population, the normal population, compared to the usual intervention, which is much lower. So our children who was submitted to this intervention, they have a better connection with their mothers, and they have a better neurodevelopment measures. They have a better IQ. And we know from other students who follow these children until they become adults, that the children who children who have high-risk mothers, when they get older, they have problems in school, they have a lower IQ, they are not able to complete to get the high school, they abandon the school before they need special class. When they are adolescent, they use drugs. They have legal problems later on. They receive smaller salaries when they are adults, and have more legal problems, contribute for violence in the society. So I was thinking that this would be some of the reasons why Jim started to use this approach to promote peace. And so diminishing violence, promoting a more diminishing inequalities, social-economic inequalities. But as we go on, as I'm thinking about this project, I think there are other things going on this intervention, and I'll tell in a minute. But coming to Ellie's work, you see that it's incredible how many different areas you are now, and how many different interventions you have been developing and to support our families and patients with mental disorders. Much more than only anxiety disorders, eating disorders. These dependent traits is very interesting work. But I saw something in autism as well, and other areas. Now, looking for mediators, trying to understand physiopathology using neuroimaging or even genetics is such a widespread, such a wild area investments. So very impressive, Eli. And but there is something that makes a link with Jim's work, and I think that most of the basis of the interventions involve the parents and the connection of the parents with their child. So an important component, I think, probably in all, are the supportive role of the parents, and the supportive role of the parent involving validating the child, the child is suffering, and also the being able to make the child think that they can do it, they trust in themselves to do it, and so to transmit this feeling for the child, I believe you have to have a strong bond, right? So bonding is very important to support this intervention, which is effective. So again, what Jim is talking early in life, this relationship with the parents and the child are very relevant for us, even to help our children, not only to diminish the prevalence of mental disorder, but more consistent here, to help parents to be able to change or improve the lives of their children. So concluding, why I think Jim and Eli has a very...
Now this part I have to get because I'm going to send it to my mother.
Why I believe that you and Jim had very good mothers is because at the end of these 3 days, you said, Eli, that how grateful you are. So you came here, gave us a lot of your time, donate a lot of your time, share all you know about this knowledge you developed to our community, to our people, to our society. Jim as well, you have been doing that for almost 30 years now, and you feel grateful. And I think the ability, the possibility of having this feeling has to do the relationship you guys had with your mother. So say hello to your mother, because I'm grateful to your mother, because I think we're talking about affiliative genes, and these affiliative genes, they're very important early, only will develop early in life. So a moment of specific moment of neuroplasticity that makes this experience of enjoying, right? Enjoying and sharing, enjoying, and being the other, the empathy with the other, learning with you and changing your environment. And also, I understand why Jim talks about this intervention as peaceful, because it develops compassion, right? You cannot do something bad for another person. You cannot kill someone. You feel bad about that. So, and you feel bad because we have this opportunity in life to have one person or both parents that put us at the center of their lives and took care and nurture and took care of all our needs and help us to develop these genes that in the end make us feel grateful, right? So again, so thanks a lot, Jim, for being here. Thanks a lot, Eli. And I also want to thanks to the families that help us to support us to make this trip, this visit. This involves the família Robert Lira, a família do Marco Aurélio Luz Gonçalves, o Banco Santander, University of São Paulo, University of Yale, and in name of all the people that organized this meeting, I'd like to understand Pedro Macu and Isabel Ataide. So we probably will have Pedro. Can we? Probably we're about to finish. I only would like to ask the chief of our department just to close the meeting, and then maybe you can send questions to Eli. Okay, can you do that? That's gonna have to speak here because the camera is here. So Orestes Forlens is the chair of our department.
Thank you. Thank you, Eli. Thank you. I think that's too much for me. I think I just have to thank you so much for coming again to Brazil and sharing all this knowledge and all this support to our students, young researchers, and our professors as well. So really, it's a excellent thing to have you here. I might have a pressing question to you, but I'll wait until the end of the session, not to bump into other questions that might arise in this specific meetings.
Because it's already...
Yeah.
Yes, I have.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Well,
A gente tem duas apresentações dessas.
because, well, you showed a model of